All right, my beautiful people, we are back with another episode of Unscripted with your girl, Ange. And so today's topic is going to be a little bit of an interesting one that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Well, I think about these questions a lot because I'm a deep thinker by nature and naturally curious. But anyway, so let me set the tone as I do. So a few days ago, I was scrolling through old photos on my old phone, and I have this old digital camera, and I was uploading photos to my computer, and I was like, you know how sometimes you're just looking for one picture because you're like, oh, I remember this picture, like I need to go into this hyper state and find this photo that I'm remembering. And then suddenly you're kind of in this deep dive 2 years into your camera roll. So I came across a photo from a time in my life that I always tell myself that I miss. And I looked at it for a while and thought, things were just so much simpler back then. But then something kind of strange happened. I remember the day that photo was taken, and it wasn't simple at all. It was from my high school graduation. I was stressed, I was overwhelmed. I remember just lying awake at night thinking that life would finally get better once I got through that chapter. And at the time, I wasn't wishing I could stay there. I was actually wishing I could just leave and be done with this. So why is it that now looking back, that same period of my life feels almost magical? And I've noticed myself kind of doing this over and over again. I'll miss a city I couldn't wait to leave. I'll miss a version of myself who is just kind of constantly anxious, as we all are. Or I'll just, something as simple as I'll miss friendships that weren't always easy. And sometimes I'll even miss routines that I complained about every single day. And it's a bit strange, isn't it? We spend so much of our lives trying to get to the next chapter that we tell ourselves, once I finish school, once I get that job, once I move, once this stressful period of my life is over, we become so focused on what comes next that we barely notice the chapter that we're currently living in. And flash forward years later, we look back at that same exact time with just so much tenderness, and it's almost as if we've forgotten what it was actually like living through that time. And for a long time, I assumed this meant I was just nostalgic. And maybe I just missed being younger, I missed having fewer responsibilities, maybe I just missed people who were part of a certain chapter. And the more I thought about it, the less those expectations seemed to fit. Because sometimes I don't miss the happiest seasons of my life, sometimes I miss the hardest ones. The ones where I was confused, I felt lost, where if you had asked me back then, I probably would have said, I can't wait for this to be over. So what exactly is it that changes? Do our memories become more beautiful with time? Or were those moments more meaningful than I ever realized while I was living them? And it turns out that psychologists have been asking this exact question for decades. And the answer isn't that our memories are lying to us, which is good news. It's actually more interesting than that. And for the longest time, I just assumed memory kind of worked like a photo album. Something happened, your brain stores it away, and then years later you remember it, and when you're just pulling that exact same memory off of the shelf. And this seems simple, except that's not really how memory works. And memory is one of those fascinating things I'm always curious about. But one of the things that surprised me while researching for this video is that psychologists don't think of memory as a recording, kind of like how you would think it should be stored. They think of it as a reconstruction. So every time we remember something, our brain isn't pressing play, it's rebuilding the memory from different pieces, our emotions, the details we still do remember, the stories we've told ourselves about that experience, and even the person we've become since it happened. So in other words, every time we revisit the past, we're not just remembering it, we're interpreting it. And that completely changed the way I think about nostalgia. Because if memory is reconstructive, then maybe the question isn't, why do I remember the past differently? Maybe the better question would be, why is my brain remembering it this way? And one concept that kept coming up is something called rosy retrospection. It sounds so beautiful, but this is the concept that we have the tendency to remember past experiences as being more positive than they actually felt in the moment. And researchers have found this with vacations, school years, relationships, major life events, and even ordinary seasons of life. think about a vacation, and while you're there, maybe your flight gets delayed, your hotel isn't what you expected, you argue with people you're traveling with, you get sunburned, you spend way more money than you planned. But months later, when someone asks you about that trip, you don't usually start with the delayed flight or the bad hotel, or you might, but sometimes you'll remember the sunset, laughing over dinner, how alive you felt exploring somewhere new, and your brain doesn't erase the difficult parts. It just stopped treating them as the most important parts of the story. And I wonder if we do the same thing with entire chapters of our lives. And, maybe that's why people say they miss college, even though they were constantly stressed about, and well, in my case, exams. Or, maybe they miss their childhood, even though when we're all younger, we're just like, I can't wait to grow up. Or even something that us adults can understand, that maybe you miss an old relationship, even if you spent months wondering whether it was making you happy, overall. And it's tempting to conclude that our brains are just unreliable, that nostalgia is just some sort of trick it's playing on us, and that we're kind of just all walking around wearing rose-colored glasses. But I don't really think that's what's happening here, because if our brains simply wanted to fool us, why don't we remember every single part of the past as perfect? So why do certain memories stay vivid while others sort of disappear? And why do we remember how someone made us feel but forget what we argued about? And that made me realize something, that maybe memory isn't trying to preserve every detail, maybe it's trying to preserve meaning. And maybe that's why years later we can forget the exact words that someone said, but we never forget how safe we felt sitting across from them. We don't forget how we felt. And maybe that's why we can't remember what we did on a random Tuesday, but we can remember exactly where we were when our life quietly started to change. And our memories aren't just archives, they're stories, and like every story, they're shaped by what mattered most. The more I read about memory, the more I realize this video was never really about remembering, it's about meaning. Now, there's a psychologist named Dan McAdams who studies something called narrative identity. Now, the basic idea is that we all make sense of our lives by turning them into stories, not because we're trying to write a novel, but because stories help us answer one very important question: who am I? Think about it. When someone asks you about your life, you probably don't list every single thing that's ever happened to you. You tell a story. You talk about how the people who you were around changed you, the moments that shaped you, the decisions you regret, the risks you took, the chapters that felt like turning points. And without realizing it, you've become both the author and the narrator of your own life. And so that's why I don't think nostalgia is really about going backwards. I think it's about trying to understand the person that we used to be. Because when I look back at, certain chapters of my life, I don't just remember the places. I remember who I was in those places. And I remember the version of myself who still believed certain things and who hadn't experienced certain disappointments yet. And, I was excited about possibilities that hadn't become reality at that point. And sometimes I think we miss a place as well, when what we really miss is the hope we carried while we were there. Now, this all sounds beautiful and romantic, but, we have to understand that maybe we miss the version of ourselves who believed everything was still possible. And, we don't miss the actual relationship, the actual friendship, the actual college experience. And those aren't the same thing. And realizing that changed how I think about nostalgia, because if I convince myself that the past was perfect, then the only solution is to go back, right? But if I can recognize what I actually miss, which is connection, wonder, curiosity, community, hope, a sense of direction, then maybe those things aren't trapped in the past after all. And, those are things that we can always start to build again. Now, there's another psychological idea that I kept coming back to while I was researching this, and it's called the peak end rule. And researchers have found that we don't remember experiences by averaging every single moment. So instead, what our memories will do is they heavily are shaped by two things: the emotional peak and the ending. So this means an entire chapter of your life can become summarized by just a handful of moments. So a graduation, a goodbye, a road trip, a conversation. It's almost like our minds kind of create highlight reels instead of documentaries. And maybe that's why the past can feel so beautiful, not because every ordinary Tuesday was magical, but because our minds stitched together the moments that mattered the most. And, looking back, we don't see every stressful assignment, exam, every boring afternoon, every ordinary commute. We see the people, we see the laughter, the sunsets, the milestones, the moments that made us feel alive, what we kind of call core memories. And that's not really your brain lying to you. It's what it's doing is it's reminding us what was worth holding on to in the first place. Now, after thinking about this, I don't think nostalgia is something we need to fight. I don't think it's a weakness, and I don't think it's our brain trying to convince us that life used to be better either. I think it's just something different. I think nostalgia is our mind's way of pointing toward the moments that mattered. And, they weren't perfect, but they changed us in some way. And if you really think about it, the chapters we miss weren't beautiful every single day. They weren't perfect. There were, bad mornings, stressful weeks, arguments, moments where, we kind of go into the spiral. We just question everything. But there were days that felt painfully ordinary. And it's just that time has a way of sort of sanding down the sharp edges, not with the objective of deceiving us, but to leave us with the shape of what that season meant. And I think that is what the real gift of nostalgia gives us. It reminds us of what we value. When I miss a certain time in my life now, I try to ask myself a different question. Not how do I go back there, or what can I do to recreate this, but more so, what is it that I actually miss? Is it the people, the sense of community, the excitement of beginning something new? Because if I can answer that honestly, then maybe those things are trapped in the past, which is a good thing. Maybe they're just invitations, trying to nudge us to make more meaningful friendships or try something new or to slow down. And, to say yes to experiences that I'll someday look back on with that same warmth, that same nostalgia. Because the past has something the present will never have. It has an ending, and we know how those stories turned out. We know which moments became important. We know what conversations we'd give anything to hear one more time. And the present doesn't have that luxury. It's still unfinished, uncertain, becoming, and maybe that's why it's so easy to overlook. But, one day, kind of in this beautiful way, today will become part of your past at some point. And one day you're going to look back on this season of your life kind of and think you'd be able to see it through this lens that you're using to look at yesterday. It's very meta, but, stay with me here. So the routines you're doing now feel repetitive. The people in your life right now, you just kind of assume they'll always be there. But even the version of yourself that you're still learning to love, one day those may become the very things you find yourself missing. And I think that's the lesson nostalgia has been trying to teach us all along. Not that the best days are behind us, but that the ordinary moments we're rushing through today may be the memories that we're going to treasure tomorrow. So, you have to think that the goal isn't to stop looking back. Maybe it's just to let the past remind us to pay a little more attention to the life that's unfolding right in front of us. Because, years from now, you'll probably wish you could come back to an ordinary day like today, and maybe, before it becomes a memory, it's worth living it. And, my mom always really I can really make sure that I understand this, when I complain about, oh my goodness, I'm going through this in med school, or, this thing is happening to me. She's like, you're going to look back and you're going to be like, wow, like you're going to really miss this. And even, several years ago, I couldn't even imagine myself going to med school, or didn't think I had it in me to do it. And so you kind of have to be grateful and really live in the moment, I guess, as cliche as that sounds. And maybe you'll look back on a certain season of your life with the same warmth that you now reserve for, a different chapter. So, as I said, like, nostalgia isn't trying to tell you that life used to be better. It's just reminding you that ordinary moments become extraordinary with time. And, and if that's true, then maybe the life you're going to miss someday is the one you're living right now. And, with all that being said, if this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear your perspective. And, if you'd like to put in the comments, or you feel comfortable, I'm really curious, like, what's one chapter of your life you find yourself romanticizing? And after watching this, do you think you're really missing that time, or are you missing something deeper? I read every single comment that you guys post, and some of my favorite conversations happen there. And if you enjoy these kinds of videos where we explore the psychology behind everyday experiences, I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'd love to have you here for the next conversation. And until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.